March 17, 1981. 03:47 hours. Beale Air Force Base, Northern California. Major Thomas Estes sat as the cockpit of SR-71 tail number 117972, watching condensation form on the inside of his pressure suit visor as ground crew completed final checks on the Pratt & Whitney J58 engines. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, the temperature hovered at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. In 6 hours, at cruise altitude over the Barents Sea, the skin of this aircraft would reach temperatures exceeding 600 degrees, hot enough to make the titanium airframe glow. What Estes didn't know, what no one at Beale knew that morning, was that this particular reconnaissance sortie, designated Operation Teal Ruby, would become the closest the United States came to losing an SR-71 to Soviet interception, and that the solution would involve not superior technology or pilot skill, but a calculated piece of Cold War theater so audacious it would be classified for 37 years. The SR-71 Blackbird represented the apex of American reconnaissance capability in 1981. Capable of sustained flight at Mach 3.2 and altitudes exceeding 85,000 feet, it operated in a flight regime where the curvature of the Earth became visible and where conventional aircraft could not follow. But the Blackbird's invulnerability rested on a narrow margin. Soviet SA-5 Gammon surface-to-air missiles, when fired in salvos from overlapping batteries, could reach altitudes of 90,000 feet. Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat interceptors, though unable to sustain pursuit, could execute zoom climb intercepts that briefly brought them into firing range. The operational calculus was simple. The SR-71 survived not because it was untouchable, but because Soviet systems couldn't coordinate fast enough to exploit the brief windows when it was vulnerable. Operation Teal Ruby would test that assumption to destruction. To understand what went wrong on March 17th, you have to go back to the strategic context of early 1981. Ronald Reagan had been president for 56 days. The Cold War, after a period of détente in the 1970s, was entering a new phase of confrontation. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. NATO was preparing to deploy Pershing II missiles in Western Europe. The Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's Star Wars program, was still 2 years away, but American intelligence agencies were already tasked with assessing Soviet advances in directed energy weapons, satellite-killing lasers, and anti-ballistic missile systems. The Barents Sea, bordered by Soviet naval bases at Severomorsk and Polyarny, was a critical intelligence target. Submarine pens, missile testing ranges, and early warning radar installations dotted the Kola Peninsula. Overhead reconnaissance provided imagery that ground-based signals intelligence and human sources could not. The SR-71 was the only platform capable of penetrating that far into Soviet-defended airspace and returning. Major Thomas Estes, Thomas. The pilot was 34 years old. He had logged 112 hours in the SR-71, making him experienced but not senior among Blackbird pilots. His background was conventional: Air Force Academy graduate, F-4 Phantom pilot in Vietnam, selection for the SR-71 program in 1979. His reconnaissance systems officer, Captain Raymond Keller, was 31. Keller operated the aircraft's sensor suite: optical cameras, synthetic aperture radar, signals intelligence collectors. The two men had flown together for 18 months. They were competent, disciplined, and aware that every mission over Soviet territory carried the risk of mechanical failure, missile engagement, or diplomatic incident. What they were not prepared for was a failure of the operational plan itself. The mission profile for Teal Ruby called for Estes and Keller to depart Beale, refuel over the North Atlantic from a KC-135 tanker, accelerate to operational speed and altitude, and execute a high-speed pass along the northern coast of the Kola Peninsula at 83,000 feet, Total time in Soviet-defended airspace, 11 minutes. The flight plan had been calculated to exploit a gap in Soviet radar coverage identified by NSA signals intelligence. SA-5 batteries at Severomorsk and Murmansk would track the aircraft, but their fire control radars, according to NSA analysis, could not maintain lock at the SR-71's speed and altitude when the aircraft flew a specific ground track that maximized range and minimized radar cross-section. The plan assumed Soviet systems would behave as they had during previous overflights. That assumption was wrong. At 05:21 hours, Estes and Keller lifted off from Biel. The SR-71 climbed slowly, burning fuel to reduce weight before the first refueling. At 06:48 hours, over the Atlantic west of Iceland, they rendezvoused with the tanker. Refueling an SR-71 was a delicate operation. The aircraft's fuel tanks were designed to leak on the ground. Only at high speed and high temperature did thermal expansion seal the joints. Estes held formation beneath the tanker's boom, while Keller monitored fuel flow. 18,000 pounds transferred. The tanker broke away. Estes pushed the throttles forward, and the J-58 engines transitioned from turbojet to ramjet mode. The SR-71 accelerated through Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3. At Mach 3.2, the aircraft was covering 1 mile every 2 seconds. The airframe began to heat. Titanium skin panels expanded. The aircraft, which had been 68 feet long on the ground, stretched nearly 6 inches at cruise. At 07:34 hours, Estes crossed into Soviet-monitored airspace northeast of Norway. Soviet early warning radars at Pechenga detected the incursion immediately. Standard procedure: Soviet air defense networks tracked all Western reconnaissance flights. The question was whether they would engage. At 07:39 hours, Keller's radar warning receiver lit up. SA-5 fire control radars at Severomorsk had locked onto the aircraft. Estes maintained course and speed. The SR-71's defensive system, a combination of speed, altitude, and radar jamming pods, was designed to break radar lock or force missiles to burn out before reaching intercept altitude. For 3 minutes, the engagement proceeded as expected. Soviet radars tracked. Soviet missile batteries did not fire. Then, at 07:42 hours, everything changed. Keller's threat display showed a new radar signature. A Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat had launched from Olenia Air Base and was climbing rapidly on an intercept vector. This was unusual. MiG-25s rarely attempted intercepts of SR-71s because the Foxbat's high-altitude performance, while impressive, was brief. The aircraft could zoom climb to 85,000 feet, but it could only sustain that altitude for a few minutes before fuel depletion forced descent. Soviet doctrine typically reserved MiG-25 intercepts for slower targets. But this Foxbat was not attempting a conventional intercept. According to declassified debriefing records, the Soviet pilot was executing a coordinated ambush. SA-5 batteries were not firing immediately because they were waiting for the MiG-25 to force the SR-71 into a predictable evasive maneuver. Once Estes turned to avoid the Foxbat, the SA-5s would fire into the projected flight path. It was a trap, and Estes had seconds to recognize it. At 07:43 hours, Estes made the decision that would define the mission. Instead of turning away from the MiG-25, the instinctive response, he turned toward it. He pushed the throttles to maximum continuous power and nosed the SR-71 into a shallow climb, increasing altitude to 86,000 feet. The maneuver was counterintuitive. Turning toward a threat increased the closure rate and reduced reaction time. But Estes had calculated that the MiG-25 pilot, expecting evasion, would overshoot. The gamble worked. The Foxbat, already at the edge of its performance envelope, could not adjust. It flashed past the SR-71 at a combined closure rate exceeding 4,000 miles per hour. Keller, watching the threat display, saw the MiG-25's radar signature drop off the screen as the Soviet aircraft fell away, out of fuel and out of altitude. But the SA-5 batteries were still active. At 07:44 hours, Keller's warning receiver registered missile launches. 2 SA-5s fired from Severomorsk, followed seconds later by 2 more from Murmansk. The missiles climbed rapidly, their solid fuel boosters accelerating them to Mach 3.5. Soviet doctrine called for firing missiles in salvos to saturate the target's defensive systems. Estes had perhaps 90 seconds before the first missiles reached intercept altitude. The SR-71's defensive response was automatic. Radar jamming pods activated, flooding Soviet fire control radars with false returns. But jamming alone would not be enough. The missiles were already in flight, guided by inertial navigation systems that did not depend on continuous radar lock. Estes needed to break the firing solution. What happened next was a combination of physics, desperation, and institutional knowledge. Estes executed a maneuver that SR-71 pilots called a dipsy doodle, a rapid, shallow S-turn designed to force pursuing missiles to adjust their flight paths. At Mach 3.2, even a small course change required enormous energy. The missiles, flying ballistic trajectories, could not match the SR-71's lateral acceleration. The first 2 SA-5s passed behind the aircraft, detonating at 87,000 feet. The third missile came closer. Keller, monitoring the threat display, watched the missile's radar signature merge with their own. Then it separated. The missile had missed by less than 200 feet. The fourth missile, fired from Murmansk, malfunctioned. Its guidance system failed during mid-course correction, and it tumbled out of control, exploding harmlessly at 75,000 feet. At 07:46 hours, Estes and Keller exited Soviet-defended airspace. The immediate threat was over. But the mission was not. The SR-71 sensor suite had recorded the entire engagement: radar tracks, missile launches, MiG-25 intercept attempt. That data would be analyzed by NSA and CIA to assess Soviet air defense capabilities. But there was a problem. The engagement had been far more aggressive than any previous SR-71 overflight. Soviet forces had coordinated MiG-25 and SA-5 assets in a way that suggested new tactics, better training, or improved command and control systems. If the Soviets believed they had come close to shooting down an SR-71, they would refine their tactics and try again. Future missions would face even greater risk. The United States needed to convince the Soviets that the engagement had been a failure, that their new tactics had not worked. The solution came not from the Pentagon or the CIA, but from a small unit within the Air Force's Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The unit, designated the Soviet Aerospace Analysis Group, specialized in understanding how Soviet military officers thought, how they reported success and failure, and how they interpreted ambiguous events. The group's assessment was blunt. Soviet air defense commanders would report the engagement as a near success. They would claim that improved coordination had forced the SR-71 to evade, that missiles had come close, and that future attempts would succeed. To counter this narrative, the United States needed to feed the Soviets information that contradicted their own assessment. The method: a calculated intelligence leak. Within 72 hours of the mission, the Foreign Technology Division prepared a fabricated after-action report. The report, written in the style of an internal Air Force assessment, described Operation Teal Ruby as a routine reconnaissance flight with no significant Soviet response. It claimed that SA-5 radars had failed to achieve lock, that the MiG-25 intercept had been detected but posed no threat, and that the SR-71 had flown its planned route without deviation. The report included technical details, fuel consumption, sensor performance, flight parameters, that were accurate enough to seem authentic but omitted any mention of evasive maneuvers or near misses. The report was then deliberately placed in a classified document repository known to be penetrated by Soviet intelligence. The mechanism of the leak was indirect. The CIA maintained a network of double agents, Soviet intelligence officers who had been turned and were feeding information back to Moscow. One of these agents, a KGB officer assigned to the Soviet embassy in Washington, had access to classified U.S. military assessments through a compromised Defense Department contractor. The contractor, who was unaware of the double agent's true role, routinely provided documents to the KGB officer as part of a long-running espionage operation that the FBI had been monitoring but had not shut down. The Foreign Technology Division's fabricated report was placed in the contractor's workflow. Within 2 weeks, the report was in Moscow. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, analyzed the document. The assessment was credible. It matched the technical profile of SR-71 operations. It included details that only an authentic Air Force report would contain. But it contradicted the reports from Soviet air defense commanders on the Kola Peninsula, who had claimed a near-successful intercept. The GRU faced a choice: believe their own commanders or believe the American document. The GRU chose the American document. The logic was institutional. Soviet air defense officers had a history of exaggerating their successes to meet performance quotas and avoid criticism. American classified documents, by contrast, were assumed to be candid because they were internal assessments not intended for Soviet eyes. The GRU concluded that the Kola Peninsula commanders had overstated the engagement, that the SR-71 had not been seriously threatened, and that current Soviet tactics were insufficient. The consequence of this assessment was immediate. Soviet air defense doctrine was not revised. The coordinated MiG-25 and SA-5 tactic, which had come within 200 feet of destroying an SR-71, was not refined or repeated. Soviet commanders, reprimanded for exaggerating their success, became more conservative in their reporting. Future SR-71 overflights faced less aggressive responses. The United States had turned a near disaster into a strategic advantage, not by improving the SR-71's capabilities, but by manipulating Soviet perceptions of what had happened. But the operation carried risks. The double agent who facilitated the leak was under FBI surveillance. The FBI, unaware of the Foreign Technology Division's plan, was preparing to arrest the agent and the Defense Department contractor as part of a broader counterintelligence operation. If the arrests proceeded, the Soviets would realize the leak had been deliberate, and the fabricated report would lose credibility. The Foreign Technology Division needed to delay the FBI operation without revealing the deception plan. The solution was bureaucratic. The Air Force requested that the FBI postpone the arrests on the grounds that ongoing surveillance might reveal additional Soviet intelligence networks. The FBI, skeptical but willing to coordinate, agreed to a 6-month delay. The delay provided enough time for the fabricated report to be analyzed, accepted, and acted upon by Soviet intelligence. By the time the FBI arrested the contractor and the double agent in September 1981, the damage to Soviet air defense doctrine had already been done. The arrests themselves became part of the deception. The contractor, a mid-level analyst named Gerald Hauf, was charged with espionage and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The double agent, whose identity remains classified, was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. The public narrative was straightforward. An American traitor had sold secrets to the Soviets, and the FBI had stopped him. The media covered the case as a counterintelligence success. No mention was made of the fabricated report or the deliberate leak. The Soviets, observing the arrests, concluded that their intelligence operation had been compromised, but did not suspect that the information they had received was false. The deception held, Major Thomas Estes and Captain Raymond Keller were debriefed extensively after the mission. They were instructed not to discuss the engagement, even with other SR-71 crews. The official record of Operation Teal Ruby, filed with Strategic Air Command, described the mission as successful with no significant incidents. Estes flew 17 more SR-71 missions before retiring from the Air Force in 1986. Keller remained in the reconnaissance community, eventually serving as a senior analyst at the National Reconnaissance Office. Neither man was informed of the deception operation that had followed their mission. They knew only that they had survived a close call and that subsequent missions over the Barents Sea had been less eventful. The SR-71 program continued until 1998, when the aircraft was retired in favor of satellite reconnaissance and unmanned aerial vehicles. During its operational life, the SR-71 flew more than 3,500 sorties, many of them over Soviet territory. No SR-71 was ever shot down, though several came close. The March 17, 1981, engagement remained one of the most dangerous. Declassified documents released in 2018 revealed the details of the Foreign Technology Division's deception operation, including the fabricated report and the deliberate leak. The documents also revealed that Soviet air defense doctrine had been influenced by the false assessment for more than 5 years, reducing the threat to subsequent SR-71 missions throughout the mid-1980s. The case of Operation Teal Ruby illustrates several enduring principles of Cold War intelligence operations. First, technical superiority alone does not guarantee operational success. The SR-71 was the most advanced reconnaissance aircraft of its era, but it remained vulnerable to coordinated Soviet tactics. Second, perception management can be as important as physical capability. The United States did not improve the SR-71's defenses after the March 17 engagement. Instead, it changed Soviet perceptions of the engagement's outcome. Third, intelligence operations often depend on exploiting institutional dynamics within adversary organizations. The GRU's willingness to believe the fabricated report over its own commanders reflected internal Soviet tensions between field units and central intelligence agencies. Fourth, deception operations carry risks that extend beyond the immediate mission. The FBI's counterintelligence operation, the arrest of Gerald Ho, and the exposure of the double agent were all consequences of the deception plan, and all had to be managed to preserve the larger objective. What remains unknown is how close the March 17 engagement came to a different outcome. Declassified Soviet documents, released in limited form after the collapse of the USSR, confirmed that SA-5 batteries fired 4 missiles and that a MiG-25 attempted an intercept. But Soviet records do not include detailed telemetry from the missiles or the MiG-25's flight data. American estimates, based on radar tracks and Keller's threat display, suggest that the third SA-5 missile passed within 200 feet of the SR-71. But the exact miss distance is not known. If the missile had detonated 50 feet closer, the SR-71's airframe might have sustained damage. If the damage had been severe enough to force an emergency descent, Estes and Keller would have faced a choice: attempt to reach neutral airspace or eject over Soviet territory. Either option would have resulted in the loss of the aircraft and, potentially, the capture of the crew. The broader question is what the engagement reveals about the nature of Cold War brinkmanship. Both the United States and the Soviet Union operated reconnaissance systems that routinely penetrated each other's airspace. Both sides accepted the risk of escalation inherent in these operations. The SR-71 program, like the Soviet Union's own reconnaissance efforts, was premised on the belief that intelligence collection justified the risk of confrontation. But the March 17 engagement demonstrated how quickly routine operations could escalate into near crises. If the SA-5 missiles had succeeded, the United States would have faced a decision: acknowledge the loss and accept the propaganda victory for the Soviets, or retaliate in some form. If the MiG-25 had forced the SR-71 into a lower altitude where additional Soviet interceptors could engage, the engagement might have lasted longer and involved more assets. The potential for miscalculation was significant. The deception operation that followed the engagement was itself a form of escalation. By feeding false information to Soviet intelligence, the United States was not merely protecting future reconnaissance missions. It was actively shaping Soviet military doctrine. The Soviets, believing their tactics had failed, did not invest in improvements that might have made future intercepts more likely. This was a strategic gain for the United States, but it also meant that Soviet air defense capabilities remained static in an area where they might otherwise have evolved. The long-term consequence was a widening gap between American reconnaissance capabilities and Soviet countermeasures, a gap that persisted until the end of the Cold War. In the end, Operation Teal Ruby succeeded not because of the SR-71's speed or altitude, but because of a calculated manipulation of Soviet institutional psychology. The mission that went wrong became a case study in how intelligence agencies manage failure, control narratives, and exploit adversary decision-making processes. The trick that made the Soviets look the other way was not a technical countermeasure or a piece of advanced equipment. It was a lie, carefully crafted, deliberately leaked, and strategically timed. It worked because it told the Soviets what their own institutional dynamics predisposed them to believe: that their commanders had exaggerated, that their systems had underperformed, and that the Americans remained untouchable. The truth, that the SR-71 had nearly been shot down and that Soviet tactics had been effective, was buried in classified files for 37 years. By the time the truth emerged, the Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the SR-71 had been retired. What remains is a reminder that in the world of espionage and counterintelligence, the most effective weapon is often not the one that destroys, but the one that deceives.